September 9, 1956. CBS Studio 50. Arthur Kellerman stood 10 feet from the most explosive television moment in history. Ed Sullivan extended his hand toward Elvis Presley. Elvis looked him dead in the eye and stepped back. "I know what you did to Sam Phillips," Elvis said, voice barely above a whisper, "and I know who paid you to do it." The studio went silent. 3 cameras kept rolling. 40 million Americans watched their televisions, unaware they were witnessing the birth of a cover-up that would reshape American music forever. Arthur Kellerman was the only man close enough to hear every word. He was also the man who would spend the next 67 years keeping that secret buried. But tonight, in a storage facility in Manhattan, someone found the audio recording Arthur swore he destroyed. The handshake that never happened. The words that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The recording should have been ash by now. Arthur Kellerman had fed those magnetic tapes into the incinerator himself in December of 1956, watching the acetate curl and blacken until nothing remained but smoke and the bitter taste of betrayal. He'd stood there in the CBS basement, bourbon on his breath and blood under his fingernails from where he'd clawed at the storage boxes, making sure every last fragment was destroyed. But someone was listening to Elvis's voice right now, 67 years later, in a Manhattan storage facility at 2:47 a.m. Arthur's phone buzzed against the nightstand in his Queens apartment, the blue glow cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice that emerged was disturbingly familiar. "Mr. Kellerman? This is Marcus Rivera from Meridian Documentary Films. I'm sorry to call so late, but I think you'll want to hear this immediately." Arthur's hand trembled as he reached for the glass of bourbon that had been his bedside companion for 15 years. The amber liquid sloshed, catching the light from his phone screen. "Do you have any idea what time it is, son?" "I'm in storage unit 247B in Midtown. The one registered under CBS archives, inactive since 1987. The one you thought was empty decades ago." Rivera's voice carried the electric excitement of someone who'd just unearthed buried treasure. "There's a box here labeled Sullivan Show, September 9th, 1956. Audio backup, AK personal." The bourbon glass slipped from Arthur's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. 34 years ago, he'd cleared out that storage unit himself. He'd made sure every trace of that night was erased, every backup destroyed, every witness silenced or bought off. He'd sacrificed his marriage to Eleanor, his relationship with his daughter Sarah, and his entire career to make sure those tapes never saw daylight. "You're lying." Arthur's voice cracked like old leather. "I destroyed everything." "Your initials are on the box, Mr. Kellerman. AK personal in your handwriting. And there's something else, a note taped to the reel that says insurance policy, ES handshake incident, the real story. Should I play it for you?" Arthur's chest tightened. The heart attack he'd been courting with bourbon and cigarettes for years suddenly seemed imminent. He could feel his pulse hammering against his throat, could taste the metallic tang of panic on his tongue. Don't touch anything." But Rivera was already speaking to someone else in the storage facility. "Yeah, set up the portable player. We're going to digitize this tonight." "Listen to me very carefully," Arthur said, his voice dropping to the same deadly whisper Elvis had used that night in Studio 50. "You have no idea what you're playing with. There are people who would kill to keep that recording buried. People like you, Mr. Kellerman?" The line went quiet except for the sound of Arthur's ragged breathing. In the silence, he could hear the ghost of Elvis's voice echoing through his memory. "I know what you did to Sam Phillips, and I know who paid you to do it." Words that had sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry's power structure. Words that had signed death warrants and toppled empires. Arthur had been 28 years old that night, Sullivan's golden boy, the producer everyone said had a brilliant future ahead of him. He'd been wearing his best suit, the one Eleanor had picked out for him, and he'd been planning to propose to her after the show. Instead, he'd spent the next 3 hours in a CBS conference room with men in expensive suits who spoke in euphemisms and made offers that weren't really offers at all. "Mr. Kellerman?" Rivera's voice snapped him back to the present. "I'm going to play the recording now. You can either listen to it with me, or you can read about it in tomorrow's headlines." Arthur closed his eyes and saw Eleanor's face the night she'd packed her bags, 13 years into their marriage. He saw Sarah turning away from him at her high school graduation, her eyes filled with the disappointment that had never quite faded. He saw the bourbon bottles that had replaced family dinners, the empty apartment that had become his prison. All of it to protect a secret that was about to destroy him anyway. "What do you want?" Arthur whispered. "The truth, Mr. Kellerman, all of it. Starting with why Ed Sullivan really refused to shake Elvis Presley's hand, and ending with who's been paying to keep you quiet all these years." Arthur stood up slowly, his 64-year-old bones creaking like the floorboards of his crumbling apartment. Outside his window, Queens stretched endlessly into the darkness, a maze of ordinary lives lived in ordinary ways. But there was nothing ordinary about the choice he was about to make. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. The recording was waiting. Introduction. Arthur's hands shook as he set the phone down on the nightstand, the plastic clattering against the wood like dice settling on a craps table. The bourbon had evaporated from the broken glass, leaving only the sharp scent of alcohol and regret hanging in the air. He stared at the amber stain spreading across the warped floorboards, the same floorboards Eleanor had once polished to a mirror shine, back when this place had been a home instead of a mausoleum. The apartment in Astoria had been their starter home, a 2-bedroom walk-up with thin walls and thinner bank accounts. Eleanor had picked it from a classified ad in the Times, circling it with her red pen while Arthur worked late nights at CBS, climbing the ladder that would eventually collapse beneath him. They'd planned to move somewhere better once his producer's salary kicked in, maybe get a house in Westchester with a yard for the children they'd never had. Now the radiator clanked like a prisoner rattling chains, and the refrigerator hummed with the irregular rhythm of something slowly dying. Arthur had stopped noticing the decay years ago, the way a man stops noticing his own reflection in mirrors. But Rivera's call had stripped away that merciful blindness, and suddenly he could see the apartment through Eleanor's eyes, the water stains on the ceiling that mapped out 15 years of neglect, the stacks of newspapers he'd never thrown away, the bottles that had replaced the framed photographs she'd taken when she left. He padded to the kitchen in his bare feet, avoiding the broken glass. The linoleum was cold and slightly sticky, adhering to his soles with each step. The coffee maker sat on the counter like a loyal dog, its red light blinking steadily. Arthur had programmed it years ago to brew at 6 a.m. every morning, a vestige of routine from when his days had structure and purpose. Now it mostly served as a timer, marking the passage of days that blurred together like watercolors in rain. The phone book sat in the drawer beneath the cutlery, its pages yellow and brittle. Arthur flipped through it with trembling fingers until he found what he was looking for: Kellerman, Sarah M., physical therapist. The listing was 3 years old, but it was the only connection he had to the daughter who'd stopped returning his calls sometime during the Clinton administration. Sarah would be 32 now, probably married to that accountant she'd been dating the last time they'd spoken, Michael something. A good man, Eleanor had told him during one of their brief, excruciating phone conversations. Stable, she'd said, the word carrying the weight of everything Arthur had never been. Sarah might have children of her own by now, Arthur's grandchildren, growing up without knowing his name or why their mother's face darkened whenever someone mentioned the old days in television. He'd sent birthday cards for years, first to Eleanor's sister's address in Connecticut, then to Sarah's college dorm, finally to the physical therapy clinic where she worked. The cards had started coming back returned to sender 5 years ago, and Arthur had taken the hint. Some bridges burned so completely that even the ashes were swept away. But now, standing in his kitchen at 3 a.m. with a documentary filmmaker threatening to resurrect the dead, Arthur felt the desperate urge to hear his daughter's voice. Just once. Just to remember what love sounded like without bourbon filtering it through gauze. The taxi ride to Manhattan would give him 47 minutes to prepare for the conversation that would either free him or finish him. Rivera had sounded young on the phone, maybe early 30s, the same age Arthur had been when the world exploded around him. Young enough to believe that truth was always better than silence, that justice mattered more than survival. Arthur had believed those things once, back when his hands were steady and his conscience was clear. He pulled on the same clothes he'd worn yesterday, khakis with permanent creases from years of hanging on the same bent hanger, a button-down shirt that had been white once upon a time, a cardigan with holes in the elbows that Eleanor would have darned without being asked. The face that stared back at him from the hallway mirror belonged to a stranger. Hollow cheeks, gray stubble, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. The manila envelope sat on the kitchen table where it had been for 3 months, Sarah's name written in his careful handwriting across the front. Inside, a cashier's check for $50,000 and a letter he'd rewritten 17 times, trying to explain 15 years of silence without mentioning the words that would put her in danger. An inheritance from a grandfather she'd never known, the letter claimed, insurance money that had taken decades to process. All lies, but lies that might give her a down payment on a house or send Arthur's grandchildren to college. Arthur picked up the envelope, feeling its weight like a sacrament in his hands. Whatever happened in that storage facility, whatever Rivera had found in the dark corners of CBS's forgotten archives, this had to reach Sarah first, before the headlines, before the photographs, before the world remembered Arthur Kellerman's name and why it had disappeared from the credits. The recording was waiting, but so was his daughter's forgiveness. And Arthur wasn't sure which one terrified him more. Arthur stood frozen in his kitchen, the manila envelope trembling in his hands like a dying bird. The weight of $50,000 in cashier's check felt insignificant compared to the crushing gravity of what was about to unfold. He set the envelope down carefully, as if it might shatter, and reached for the wall-mounted phone, the same avocado green rotary model that Eleanor had insisted on keeping because it has character, Arthur. His finger traced the familiar pattern of Sarah's number, muscle memory guiding him through digits he'd dialed 1,000 times but hadn't dared touch in years. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before he remembered it was past 3 in the morning. He was about to hang up when a groggy voice answered. Hello? Sarah. Her name escaped his lips like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say properly. Silence stretched between them, filled with 15 years of accumulated hurt and the static of a bad connection. Arthur could hear her breathing, could picture her sitting up in bed, recognition dawning in eyes that had once looked at him with something approaching worship. Dad? The word carried no warmth, only the weary resignation of someone who'd been expecting this call for years. Jesus Christ, it's 3 in the morning. Are you drunk? No. I mean, not really. Listen, Sarah, I need you to... Are you dying? Because that's the only reason I can think of for you to call me at this hour. Arthur laughed, a bitter sound that scraped his throat raw. Maybe. I don't know yet. He pressed his forehead against the kitchen wall, feeling the cool paint against his fevered skin. There's an envelope coming to you. Money. A lot of money. I need you to take it. I don't want your money, Dad. We've been through this. This is different. Arthur's voice cracked with an urgency he couldn't contain. There's going to be... Things are going to come out. About me, about what happened at CBS. You might see my name in the papers, and I need you to know that whatever they say, whatever you hear, I was trying to protect. The line went dead. Sarah had hung up, just as she'd hung up on him dozens of times before, but this time felt final in a way that made Arthur's chest tighten with panic. He dialed again, got a busy signal. She'd taken the phone off the hook. Arthur slammed the receiver down so hard the phone jumped off its wall mount, dangling by its cord like a hanged man. The silence in the apartment felt different now. Not the comfortable emptiness of solitude, but the suffocating vacuum left behind when your last lifeline snaps. His hands found the bourbon bottle on the counter, fingers wrapping around its familiar neck. One drink to steady his nerves, just one. But as he raised it to his lips, the apartment's buzzer erupted in a harsh metallic shriek that sent the bottle crashing to the floor. Arthur stood paralyzed as bourbon and broken glass spread across the linoleum. The buzzer sounded again, insistent and aggressive. 3:30 in the morning. Nobody visited him at 3:30 in the morning. Nobody visited him at all. He shuffled to the intercom, his bare feet crunching over glass shards. Yeah? Mr. Kellerman? It's Marcus Rivera. I'm downstairs. Arthur's blood turned to ice water. I said I'd meet you at the storage facility. Change of plans. We need to talk first, and I don't think you want this conversation happening in public. Buzz me up. Through his window, Arthur could see a black sedan parked across the street, its engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. Two figures sat in the front seats, motionless as statues. Arthur had seen cars like that before, 15 years ago, when men in expensive suits had made him offers that weren't really offers. Who's in the car, Rivera? People who are very interested in that recording. The same people who've been paying your rent for the past 15 years. Arthur's legs gave out. He slumped against the wall, the intercom slipping from his nerveless fingers. They'd found him. After 15 years of hiding in plain sight, of being the good little broken man who drank himself into irrelevance, they'd finally come to collect their investment. The buzzer sounded again, longer this time, more insistent. Arthur looked at the manila envelope on his kitchen table, at the broken glass and spilled bourbon, at the phone hanging dead from the wall. His old life, his careful, quiet, guilt-soaked existence, was ending whether he wanted it to or not. With shaking hands, he pressed the buzzer to let them in. The past had finally caught up with Arthur Kellerman, and there was nowhere left to run. Early development. The footsteps on the stairs sounded like a funeral march, slow, deliberate, climbing toward Arthur's door with the inevitability of Judgment Day. 3 sets of feet, he counted, Rivera and his 2 shadows from the sedan. Arthur pressed his ear to the door and caught fragments of hushed conversation, words that made his blood freeze, contained, liability, Sullivan's people. Arthur backed away from the door as if it were radioactive. His mind raced through escape routes, the fire escape outside his bedroom window, the service elevator that sometimes worked, the basement exit that led to the alley behind Mrs. Chen's restaurant. But his 64-year-old body couldn't outrun the reach of men who'd kept him on their payroll for 15 years without him even knowing it. The knock came soft and polite, nothing like the aggressive buzzer. "Mr. Kellerman? It's Marcus. Just me. The others are waiting in the car." Arthur's hand hovered over the deadbolt. Through the peephole, he could see a young man with kind eyes and an expensive camera bag slung over his shoulder. Rivera looked like every documentary filmmaker Arthur had ever met. Earnest, passionate, dangerously naive about the forces he was playing with. "Where did you really find that recording?" Arthur called through the door. "CBS storage facility, just like I said. But here's the thing, it wasn't abandoned. Someone's been paying the rental fee every month since 1987. Same account that's been covering your rent here in Queens." Arthur's knees buckled. He'd always wondered how he'd managed to stay afloat all these years on his meager pension and disability payments. The checks had arrived like clockwork. Rent, utilities, grocery money, always from different shell companies, always with documentation that looked legitimate enough to fool the IRS. He'd assumed it was some kind of CBS severance package, a corporate courtesy for a producer who'd given his best years to the network. He'd been wrong. "Let me in, Arthur, please. I think we're both in over our heads here." Arthur turned the locks. 3 deadbolts, 2 chains, and a police bar that Eleanor had installed after the break-in next door. The break-in that had never quite made sense, Arthur realized now. Mr. Petrov had sworn nothing was stolen, just papers scattered around, drawers opened and carefully closed, like someone had been looking for something specific. Rivera stepped into the apartment and immediately winced at the smell, stale bourbon, cigarette smoke, and the particular mustiness that accumulated when a man stopped caring about tomorrow. He was younger than he'd sounded on the phone, maybe 28, with the kind of smooth skin and bright eyes that belonged to someone who still believed the world was fundamentally fair. "Jesus, Arthur, how long have you been living like this?" "Long enough." Arthur deadbolted the door behind him. "Tell me about the men in the car." Rivera's confident demeanor cracked slightly. "They showed up about an hour after I called you. Said they were from the network's legal department, wanted to examine any CBS property before it was disturbed. But CBS doesn't have a legal department anymore. They merged with Viacom years ago." Arthur shuffled to the kitchen, glass crunching under his feet. The broken bourbon bottle lay in pieces around the refrigerator, its contents slowly seeping into the gaps between the linoleum tiles. "Did you touch the recording?" "I started to. Got maybe 10 seconds in before they knocked on the storage facility door." Rivera's voice dropped to a whisper. "Arthur, I heard something. Before they made me stop the playback, a voice I recognized. Elvis." "No. The other voice. The one responding to whatever Elvis said. It sounded like... Rivera paused, glancing toward the window where the sedan waited in the darkness. It sounded like President Kennedy. Arthur's legs gave out completely this time. He collapsed into a kitchen chair, the wood creaking under his weight. President Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, who'd been a senator in 1956, who'd been married to Jackie for all of 3 years when Elvis whispered those words that had brought down Arthur's world. "You don't understand what you're playing with," Arthur whispered. "This isn't about television history or celebrity gossip. This is about power. Real power. The kind that buries people." Rivera pulled out his phone, fingers dancing across the screen with the casual expertise of youth. "That's why I'm here instead of at the storage facility. Look, I've been documenting everything. Photos, video, audio recordings of our conversations. If something happens to me, it all goes live automatically. Dead man's switch." Arthur almost smiled. The boy thought technology could protect him from men who'd been eliminating inconvenient people since before computers were invented. "You think uploading files to the cloud is going to save you? Kid, they owned the telephone company when you were still in diapers." A car door slammed outside. Then another. Arthur peered through his kitchen window and saw the 2 figures from the sedan walking toward his building's entrance. They moved with the fluid precision of men accustomed to violence, hands resting easily inside their coat pockets. "They're coming up," Arthur said. Rivera's face went pale. For the first time since walking into Arthur's apartment, he looked genuinely frightened. "What do they want?" Arthur stared at the manila envelope on his kitchen table, at the $50,000 that would never reach his daughter now. "They want to tie up loose ends." The elevator dinged in the hallway outside. The footsteps stopped directly outside Arthur's door. No knock this time, no polite conversation, just the metallic scraping of tools against his locks. Professional sounds that meant the deadbolts and chains Eleanor had installed were as useless as tissue paper. "The fire escape," Arthur whispered, grabbing Rivera's arm. But as they moved toward the bedroom window, Rivera's phone buzzed with an incoming text. His face went white as he read it. "They've got the recording, and they know about my backup files." Rivera's hands shook as he showed Arthur the message. "Your cloud storage has been compromised. Delete everything or the girl gets hurt." Below the text was a photograph that made Arthur's bourbon-soaked stomach lurch. Sarah, his daughter, walking out of her physical therapy clinic with a small boy, maybe 5 years old, holding her hand. Arthur's grandson. The grandson he'd never met, whose existence Sarah had hidden from him for good reason. How did they... Rivera started, but Arthur was already moving. 15 years of guilt and self-imposed exile crystallized into pure protective rage. Arthur yanked open the kitchen drawer where he kept Eleanor's old revolver, the .38 special she'd insisted on after the Petrov break-in. His hands, steady for the first time in years, checked the cylinder. 5 bullets. Not many, but enough. The apartment door exploded inward with a crash that rattled every bottle on Arthur's shelves. 2 men in dark suits stepped through the splintered frame like they owned the place. The first was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and dead eyes that had seen too much killing. The second was younger, but carried himself with the same professional stillness. "Arthur Kellerman," the older man said, his voice carrying the neutral accent of someone who'd spent years erasing his origins. "You look terrible. 15 years of our generosity, and this is how you maintain yourself? Your generosity?" Arthur kept the gun hidden behind his back, finger on the trigger. "You mean my silence?" "Same thing, really." The man's eyes swept the apartment with casual disgust. "We've been patient, Arthur. Remarkably patient. But patience has its limits." Rivera stepped forward, trying to position himself between Arthur and the intruders. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but I'm documenting everything. If something happens to us..." The younger man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your dead man's switch? We killed that 20 minutes ago, along with your girlfriend's Netflix account, your mother's medical records, and every digital footprint you've created since you were 12. You exist at our discretion, Mr. Rivera. Both of you do." Arthur felt his last thread of restraint snap. These weren't just the same type of men who'd destroyed his life 15 years ago. They were the exact same men, barely aged, still cleaning up messes for masters whose names never appeared in newspapers. What did Elvis really say that night? Arthur asked, his voice steady despite the fury boiling in his chest. The older man smiled, and Arthur saw genuine amusement in those dead eyes. You were there, Arthur. You heard every word. You saw exactly what young Senator Kennedy was doing in that dressing room, what Elvis saw him doing. The memories came flooding back with sickening clarity. The after-party, Jack Kennedy, Golden Boy senator with presidential ambitions, celebrating Elvis's triumphant performance. The way Kennedy had cornered that young makeup artist, barely 18, terrified, unable to say no to a man with that much power. Elvis walking in at exactly the wrong moment. The confrontation. Elvis's voice filled with disgust. I see what you are, Senator. I see what all you Washington boys are. Kennedy's smooth response. And what are you going to do about it, hillbilly? Elvis's answer. The words that had haunted Arthur for 15 years. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man wants to be president. Arthur had been standing in the corridor, recording equipment in hand, capturing what was supposed to be casual backstage banter for the network archives. Instead, he documented the moment that would have ended Kennedy's political career before it truly began, the moment that had gotten Elvis killed. You murdered him, Arthur whispered, the gun growing heavy in his sweating palm. Not the pills, not the heart attack. You killed Elvis Presley because he wouldn't stay quiet. Elvis killed himself, the older man corrected. We just accelerated the timeline. Amazing what chronic prescription abuse can do to a man's heart. Rivera made a choking sound. You're talking about assassinating a sitting president and murdering Elvis Presley like it's a business transaction. Because that's exactly what it was. The man checked his watch with the casual indifference of someone discussing quarterly earnings. And now we have another transaction to complete. Arthur raised the gun, finger tightening on the trigger. But the photograph of Sarah and his grandson burned in his mind, and he knew, with the same terrible certainty that had kept him silent for 15 years, that pulling that trigger would sign their death warrants. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, while outside, the black sedan waited to carry away the last witnesses to a secret that had already killed a king. The gun trembled in Arthur's grip as the older man's smile widened, revealing teeth too white and perfect for someone his age. In that moment of suspended violence, Arthur's mind raced backward through 15 years of carefully constructed lies. Lies he'd told himself about why CBS had really let him go, why his marriage had crumbled so quickly, why he'd been allowed to simply disappear into Queen's obscurity. You're wondering now, aren't you, Arthur? The man's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone savoring a long-awaited revelation. Wondering how we found you so easily. Wondering why we've been so patient all these years. Arthur's finger hovered over the trigger, but something in the man's expression made him hesitate. There was no fear there, no concern about the weapon pointed at his chest. Only the smug satisfaction of someone holding all the cards. The truth is, Arthur, you never found us. We found you. September 27th, 1956. You weren't randomly assigned to backstage documentation that night. The man stepped closer, close enough that Arthur could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, something metallic that made Arthur's stomach turn. You were handpicked, specifically recruited. Eleanor recommended you herself. The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. Eleanor, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd stood by him through the early years at CBS, who'd helped him climb from sound technician to producer, who'd encouraged him to take every assignment that brought him closer to the network's inner circle. No, the word escaped as barely a whisper. Eleanor didn't know about any of this. Eleanor worked for us long before she worked for CBS. The man's smile turned predatory. State Department, officially, cultural attaché to Senator Kennedy's Foreign Relations Committee. Her job was to identify promising media personalities who could be useful. You were her masterpiece, Arthur. So eager to please, so hungry for success, so morally flexible when the stakes were right. Rivera backed toward the kitchen window, his face pale with understanding. You're saying his wife was a spy? I'm saying his wife was a patriot who understood that sometimes democracy requires undemocratic methods. The older man never took his eyes off Arthur. "The recording you made that night wasn't an accident, Arthur. It was the whole point. We needed documentation of Elvis's threat, proof of his intentions. Insurance, you might say, in case the situation required permanent resolution." Arthur's legs felt like water. The gun wavered in his grip as memories reshuffled themselves into new, horrible patterns. Eleanor's sudden enthusiasm for his backstage assignments, her detailed questions about which celebrities would be attending which events, the way she'd encouraged him to always keep his recording equipment running, to capture everything for historical posterity. "She never loved me." The words came out flat, emotionless. Arthur felt something breaking inside his chest, something that had already been cracked for 15 years, finally splitting completely apart. "Oh, she grew fond of you," the man said with casual cruelty. "Fondness wasn't the mission, but it happened anyway. Made things complicated when Kennedy became president and we needed to activate our insurance policy. Eleanor argued for keeping you in place, said you'd learn to keep quiet and could still be useful. But after Dealey Plaza," he shrugged, "too many loose ends, too many people who knew too much. Eleanor included." The apartment seemed to tilt around Arthur. Eleanor's death, the car accident in 1967, the mechanical failure that sent her sedan into the Potomac. He'd never questioned it, had been too deep in his bourbon-soaked grief to wonder why his wife had been driving alone on a back road at 3 a.m. "You killed her too." Arthur's voice came from somewhere outside his body, hollow and distant. "We retired her, just like we retired Elvis, just like we're going to retire you, unless you do exactly what we tell you." The man gestured toward Rivera, who was pressed against the kitchen window like a trapped animal. "Your young friend here made things urgent with his documentary project. 40 years was a good run for this particular secret, but times change. Technology makes burial more difficult." Arthur looked at the gun in his hand, then at the photograph of his daughter on Rivera's phone screen. Sarah, walking hand in hand with the grandson Arthur would never know. The grandson who would grow up thinking his grandfather was just another drunk who'd abandoned his family, unless Arthur did something to change that story. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, though he already knew the answer. "The recording, all copies, and your silence, permanent silence. In exchange, your daughter lives. Your grandson grows up. The world keeps spinning without knowing that sometimes its heroes are villains and its villains are patriots." Arthur raised the gun again, but this time he wasn't pointing it at the older man. This time he was pointing it at Marcus Rivera. "I'm sorry, kid," Arthur whispered, "but some secrets are worth dying for." Rivera's eyes widened, but he didn't flinch. Something in the young filmmaker's expression shifted, not fear, but recognition, like he'd been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. "Do it," Rivera said quietly. "Pull the trigger, Arthur, but know that you'll be killing the only person in this room who actually gives a damn about the truth." Arthur's hand shook violently. The gun felt impossibly heavy, weighted with 15 years of cowardice and compromise. Behind him, he could hear the older man's satisfied breathing, the sound of a predator watching prey destroy itself. "The boy's right, Arthur," the man said. "You've always been better at destroying things than protecting them. Your career, your marriage, your relationship with your daughter. This is just one more casualty in your impressive collection." "Shut up." Arthur's voice cracked like breaking glass. "Just shut the hell up." But Rivera stepped forward, moving closer to the gun barrel. "He's not wrong, though, is he? You've been running for 15 years, hiding in this apartment, drowning in bourbon, convinced you were protecting people by staying silent. But you weren't protecting anyone, Arthur. You were just protecting yourself." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Arthur saw himself through Rivera's eyes, a pathetic old drunk, clutching a gun he didn't have the courage to use, still believing that his cowardice could somehow be noble if he dressed it up as sacrifice. "You don't understand," Arthur whispered. "If this gets out, they'll kill Sarah. My grandson, everyone I've ever—" "They're going to kill them anyway," Rivera interrupted. "That's what these men do, Arthur. They tie up loose ends, all of them. You think they've kept you alive all these years out of kindness. You're not an asset. You're a liability they've been managing, and now they're ready to close your file permanently." The older man's laugh filled the kitchen like poison gas. The boy has a point. We've been quite patient with you, Arthur. But patience isn't the same as permanence. Your daughter's already been scheduled for retirement. Tonight, actually. Car accident, just like Eleanor. Tragic but mundane. The grandson will go to foster care, where accidents happen with depressing regularity. Arthur's vision blurred. The gun in his hand might as well have been made of lead for all the good it was doing him. Every choice led to death. Every decision ended in loss, just like 15 years ago, when he'd chosen to destroy the recording rather than face the consequences of truth. Unless, the man continued, you'd like to make a different choice this time. Rivera's phone buzzed. Without taking his eyes off Arthur's gun, he glanced at the screen. His face went white, then red with fury. "They're at Sarah's house," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Right now. Your daughter and grandson are sitting at their kitchen table with a man who says he's from your insurance company. Says you've been in an accident and he needs to verify some beneficiary information." Arthur's world collapsed inward like a dying star. The manila envelope on his kitchen table, $50,000 he'd planned to send Sarah, suddenly seemed like the pathetic gesture it was. Too little, too late, from a man who'd spent 15 years practicing cowardice and calling it love. "What do you want me to do?" Arthur asked, though speaking the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "Simple transaction," the older man said. "You kill the boy. We eliminate the documentary threat. Your daughter and grandson live. You live. Everyone wins except the one person in this room naive enough to believe that truth matters more than survival." Arthur looked at Rivera, really looked at him. The young man's face held no pleading, no desperate bargaining for his life. Instead, Arthur saw something he'd forgotten existed. Absolute certainty. The kind of moral clarity Arthur had possessed once, before 15 years of bourbon and compromise had worn it away. "There's a third option," Rivera said quietly. "You could try telling the truth for once in your miserable life." "The truth gets people killed," Arthur replied, but his conviction was cracking. "So does silence. Elvis is still dead. Kennedy still became president. Your wife is still murdered. Your daughter still hates you. 15 years of protecting these bastards, and what do you have to show for it?" Arthur's finger loosened on the trigger. In the sudden quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat, irregular and weak after decades of abuse. How many heartbeats did he have left? How many chances to do something that mattered? The older man sensed the shift and stepped forward. "Arthur, think about your grandson. Think about—" "No." Arthur's voice was steadier than it had been in years. "I'm done thinking about consequences. I'm done protecting murderers." He swung the gun around, pointing it at the older man's chest. "Rivera," he said, "I hope that dead man's switch of yours works better than you think it does." The older man's expression didn't change, but Arthur caught the microscopic tightening around his eyes, the first crack in 15 years of absolute control. Behind that perfect composure, Arthur glimpsed something he'd never seen before: uncertainty. "You're bluffing," the man said, but his voice had lost its casual authority. 64 years old, arthritic hands, 15 years of alcohol poisoning. You couldn't hit the broad side of a... Arthur pulled the trigger. The shot exploded through the cramped kitchen like thunder, deafeningly loud in the confined space. The older man staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, dark blood seeping between his fingers. His perfect composure shattered completely, replaced by shock, and something Arthur had never expected to see in those dead eyes: fear. "Jesus Christ!" Rivera breathed, pressing himself against the kitchen window. The younger operative reached inside his jacket, but Arthur was already swinging the gun toward him. "Don't." Arthur's voice carried a new authority, born from the realization that he had nothing left to lose. "Unless you want to join your partner in early retirement." The man's hand froze halfway to his weapon. For the first time since they'd entered his apartment, Arthur held the advantage. "The dead man's switch," Arthur said to Rivera, never taking his eyes off the operatives. "Tell me it's real." Rivera's fingers flew across his phone screen, blood returning to his face. "Real as cancer. If I don't check in every 6 hours, everything goes live. The restored audio, the documentary footage, witness interviews, financial records tracing Kennedy's campaign contributions back to..." Enough. The older man was leaning against Arthur's refrigerator, trying to stem the blood flow from his shoulder. "You have no idea what you're unleashing. The networks alone, NBC, ABC, even your precious CBS, they've all been part of this from the beginning. You release that information, and you'll destroy more than just Kennedy's legacy. You'll bring down the entire—" "Good." Arthur's voice was calm now, steadier than it had been in years. The bourbon shakes were gone, replaced by crystalline clarity. Maybe it's time people knew what their heroes really were. Rivera was typing frantically on his phone. "I'm sending Sarah a message right now, telling her to get out of the house, take your grandson somewhere public. Police station, hospital, anywhere with witnesses." Arthur felt something loosening in his chest, not the familiar tightness of guilt and regret, but something else entirely. Relief, maybe, or possibly redemption, though he wasn't sure he deserved either. "The recording," the older man said through gritted teeth. "Where is it?" Arthur laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine warmth. "Gone. I burned it 15 years ago, just like I told everyone. But you made one mistake." He gestured toward Rivera's phone. "Technology. Amazing what they can do with background audio these days. Clean up old footage, isolate voices, enhance frequencies that were thought lost forever." The younger operative took a step forward, but Arthur shifted the gun toward him. "I wouldn't. Not unless you want to explain to your superiors how you let a drunk old man ruin 40 years of careful planning." Rivera's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face broke into the first smile Arthur had seen from him. "Sarah's out. She took your grandson to the police station. Says there's something wrong with the insurance man. He knew too much about your background, asked too many specific questions." Arthur felt his legs nearly give out with relief. Sarah was safe. His grandson, whose name he still didn't know, was safe. For the first time in 15 years, Arthur had actually protected something instead of destroying it. The older man was growing pale from blood loss, but his voice remained steady. "This isn't over, Arthur. You think releasing that information will change anything? Kennedy's been dead for 20 years. Elvis longer than that. You're exposing crimes committed by ghosts." "Maybe." Arthur kept the gun trained on the younger operative while addressing his bleeding partner. "But ghosts have a way of haunting the living, and some truths are worth dying for." He paused, thinking of Eleanor, of Elvis, of all the voices silenced to protect powerful men's reputations. "Rivera, how long until your documentary goes live?" Rivera checked his phone again. 6 hours if I don't stop it. But I can accelerate the timeline. Push it live right now if you want." Arthur looked around his cramped kitchen, at the empty bourbon bottles lining the counters, at the photograph of Sarah he'd stared at every morning for 15 years, at the two men who'd spent decades believing they could control truth itself through violence and intimidation. "Do it," Arthur said quietly. "It's time." Rivera's thumb hovered over his phone screen for 1 heartbeat, 2. Then he pressed down. "It's done," he said. "The truth is out there now, all of it." Arthur nodded, still pointing the gun at the younger operative. Outside his window, he could hear sirens approaching. Whether called by neighbors reporting gunshots or by Rivera's emergency protocols, he didn't know. What he did know was that for the first time in 15 years, Arthur Kellerman was no longer afraid. The sirens grew louder, their wails cutting through the October afternoon like mourning songs. Arthur kept the gun steady, watching the color drain from the older man's face as blood seeped between his fingers. In the distance, he could hear car doors slamming, voices shouting orders, the heavy footsteps of authority ascending his building's rotting staircase. Arthur Rivera's voice was gentle now, almost tender. "You need to put the gun down. When they come through that door—" "I know." Arthur's voice carried a strange serenity. He looked at the weapon in his hand, Sarah's grandfather's service revolver, carried through Korea and 30 years of police work before ending up in Arthur's desk drawer, like a forgotten prayer. Funny thing about being afraid for 15 years. When it finally stops, the silence is deafening. The younger operative shifted slightly, testing Arthur's attention. Without looking away from his bleeding partner, Arthur adjusted his aim. "Don't. I may be old, but I'm not done yet." Through his kitchen window, Arthur could see news vans already gathering on the street below, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Rivera's documentary was spreading across the internet, each share and download carrying Elvis's words further into the world. The truth has a momentum all its own, Arthur thought. Once it starts rolling, even dead presidents can't stop it. Kellerman? The voice from the hallway was sharp, professional. NYPD, open the door. Arthur looked at Rivera, who was watching him with something approaching admiration. When they ask you about this, Arthur said, tell them I wasn't a hero. Heroes don't wait 15 years to do the right thing. What should I tell them you were? Arthur considered this, thinking of Eleanor's betrayal, of Elvis's whispered words, of Sarah's face the last time they'd spoken. A man who finally stopped running from his own conscience. The pounding on his apartment door grew more insistent. Arthur could hear them preparing to break it down, the familiar choreography of authority asserting itself. He thought of all the doors he'd walked through in his life. CBS studios, recording booths, bars, divorce courts, this crumbling apartment that had been both his prison and his sanctuary. Arthur, the older man said, his voice weaker now but still carrying that infuriating certainty. You think this changes anything? Tomorrow there will be congressional hearings, investigations, committees. And in 6 months, when the news cycle moves on, we'll still be here. We'll still be doing what needs to be done. Arthur smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face after so many years of practiced bitterness. Maybe. But Elvis's words will still be out there too, and sometimes that's enough. The apartment door exploded inward. Police officers flooded through the entrance, weapons drawn, voices overlapping in sharp commands. Arthur set the gun on his kitchen counter and raised his hands, feeling lighter than he had in decades. As they cuffed him, Arthur caught Rivera's eye one final time. The young filmmaker was recording everything on his phone, documenting this last scene in a story that had begun on a September night in 1956 when a young man from Memphis had whispered words that shook the foundations of power. The audio quality on that recording, Arthur called out as they led him toward the door. Elvis was closer to the microphone than anyone knew. Every word should be crystal clear. Rivera nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. The truth was loose now, spreading through fiber optic cables and wireless networks, reaching into living rooms and coffee shops and college dormitories where young people would hear Elvis Presley's voice, saying things their grandparents had never imagined. The hallway smelled like decades of other people's lives, cooking spices, cigarette smoke, the accumulated weight of small tragedies and smaller triumphs. Arthur had walked this hallway thousands of times, always alone, always carrying the burden of what he knew. Now, as they guided him toward the stairs, he felt something he'd forgotten was possible: peace. Outside, the October sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of rain. Arthur breathed in the crisp air, tasting autumn and possibility. Somewhere in the city, Sarah was holding his grandson close, both of them safe because Arthur had finally found the courage to stop protecting the wrong people. As they helped him into the police car, Arthur caught sight of his reflection in the window. 64 years old, unshaven, wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades. But his eyes were clear for the first time in 15 years, no longer clouded by bourbon and regret. The car pulled away from his building, leaving behind the news vans and the curious neighbors and the apartment where Arthur Kellerman had spent 15 years learning the difference between silence and peace. Behind him, Marcus Rivera stood on the sidewalk, still recording, still bearing witness to the moment when truth finally won. Arthur closed his eyes and listened to Elvis's words echoing across the years, no longer buried, no longer afraid,